And happy that you've all decided to come out and spend a little time on our campus. And I think we've got a very pleasurable evening ahead of us. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker is George Thomas. George, here. He's the principal organizer of this year's Furness Fest. He is a partner with Susan Snyder in Civic Visions, a consulting practice that combines an understanding of both the contemporary and historic culture that frames and assists communities and institutions in framing and shaping their narratives. In addition, he finds time to teach at the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard, which Michelle can get in between those two. For more than 40 years, George has been at the center of the Frank Furness studies. This began in the early 1970s when he delayed his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania to undertake the research for the Philadelphia Museum exhibits, the architecture of Frank Furness, that transformed our understanding of Frank Furness and his place in the American pantheon. When George began, Furness was understood or considered an outside renegade, known for most from a handful of commissions. George just basically transformed our understanding of that narrative by showing that Furness had achieved nearly 450 commissions for the most powerful institutions in Philadelphia. George has worked as a consulting historian with Hyman Myers, William over here, a colleague of ours, for the restoration of the Philadelphia Academy of the Fine Arts that brought that jewel of Philadelphia creativity back to its original vigor in the time for the centennial in 1976. 15 years later, in the late 1980s, he returned to Furness as a consulting historian for the restoration of the University of Pennsylvania's library with Venturi Scott Brown and Associates. At that time, he organized a major exhibit on Furness that was accompanied by an encyclopedic Frank Furness, The Complete Works, that brought the Furness portfolio to more than 600 projects. 5 years later, with that book, which stimulated an additional 50 projects through discovery and raised the total of projects to 700 designs and prompted an addition to the catalog titled The More Complete Works. 20 years after The Complete Works, George has returned to Furness Studies for what he promises, these are his words, will be his last time. He has cultured this exhibit together with a host of other exhibits scattered around Philadelphia that encompasses the Furness 2012 Festival and promises a book next year, Furness Architecture in the Age of the Great Machines. Tonight, George will discuss the central topics of that book, raising questions of nature and versus nurture in the career of Frank Furness in relationship to the design of our wonderful building at the Baldwin School. And with that, I'd like to ask George to come up and
see if we can get this so I can be heard. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you for your welcome and for your attendance this evening. It is fun to look out and see familiar faces. Mine and Sandy have been stalwarts at Frank Furness projects dating back into the early 1970s, so that's been a couple of weeks. And this fair couple over here have shown up with actually most of these lectures and all of the exhibits, and every time I go anywhere, they're here. So that's pretty cool. And usually we're having some success with at least 8 people in Philadelphia. That's exciting. this lecture and the 8 exhibits that are scattered around Philadelphia are part of an attempt to get people to begin to see Philadelphia in a different way. In the last few years, Philadelphia has been typically characterized more in terms of 1776 than in terms of the great city of creativity that is at the center of really the creation of the modern world. And in my sense, that's a much more interesting story than ancestor worship and the connection of a few people to events a long time ago. And so I want to frame this talk tonight in the larger context of having you see Philadelphia as a place of extraordinary creativity and to understand Frank Furness in his role in that setting. The thumbnail talk that I give at Penn when I try to introduce undergraduates to this idea is that I see Philadelphia as the center of not one revolution, but 7 or 8. And those revolutions begin with William Penn in 1682 with the idea of a community that anybody could live in. They didn't have to have a particular religion. It was open to all. The modern diverse world comes out of what William Penn created. And then in the early to mid-18th century, Benjamin Franklin came up with the idea of a college that wasn't aimed at looking at biblical studies in Latin and Greek to make ministers the way Harvard and Yale were, but made a college that was aimed at the present and the future, taught its courses in modern English, created a curriculum that included modern geography and geology and natural sciences, and really creates modern education. Harvard of today is much closer to what Franklin created than Penn is to what Harvard was. And then, of course, there's 1776 and the very powerful ideas that came out of that. And it happened in Philadelphia because we were in this open community. The people from Virginia, where there were Episcopalians, and Boston, where there were Puritans, Baltimore, where there were Catholics, could all meet and have their own churches in one city in America, which was Philadelphia. And then in the 19th century, Philadelphia is the center of one revolution after another in industry. And Philadelphia is really the premier center of industrial transformation. The great ideas of industrial standardization, scientific management, all coming out of Philadelphia shops, largely because, as we will discuss later, Philadelphia is largely run in the 19th century by engineers. Philadelphia has as its premier cultural institution the Franklin Institute. Its members run every major board, all major corporations, the railroads, what have you, and make this city a city that is more than any other in the world in the 19th century aimed at the future. And as you'll see, Frank Furness is the architect. And he begins to explain what Frank Furness is doing and what his architecture is about. And then, because of the wealth that Philadelphia created, that meant that the typical worker could afford their own house. They could shop and fill their houses with stuff from the 14 department stores on Market Street. Philadelphia leads the consumer revolution. There are all those resorts up and down the Jersey Shore that are a huge part of the life of the region. But it's also a city whose artists and architects become engaged with the great topics of the modern world. Thomas Eakins is painting doctors into surgery. Frank Furness is incorporating the new materials of the modern world into his practice and his design. And then in the 20th century, in 1945, that funny machine at Penn called ENIAC was created. The information age was created. If you line those revolutions up, my sense is there's no city in the world that produced such a change. And that is the great narrative that Philadelphia needs to capture, and this region needs to capture, and needs to reclaim. The exhibits that we're doing are sponsored by the William Penn Foundation. Chairman Nowak gave us a great seed grant that got all this going. And this is the beginning of Jeremy's goal of getting people to see our community in a way beyond the ancestor worship 1776, and we know that at least as much as 1776 as ENIAC, and the two are part of the same revolutionary culture. For our purposes tonight, I want to remind you, first of all, of another of the great architects of 19th century Philadelphia, the great rival of Frank Furness, is Joseph Wilson. Joseph Wilson, in many ways, is the exact counterpart to what Furness is doing. Furness is sort of the Frank Gehry form and expression architect of his day. Joseph Wilson is the engineer / architect who was out creating the systems, designing the vast train sheds and enormous expansive spaces using modern technology. That is the counter to what Furness is doing. Between those two men, the great lines of the possibilities of the modern world all come back to Philadelphia in the 1870s. In the 1870s, Wilson is the architect for the Pennsylvania Railroad because he's actually their in-house architect. He's working in their offices as a designer on their team. And as part of that, he designs the first of the hotels that was on the site as part of the development of Bryn Mawr, with the idea that people would stay at the hotel and they'd look around and say, wow, it's easy in Philly, and what is it, product across the street that the Pennsylvania Railroad is selling, and I could buy that and live here, wouldn't that be great? In 1875, 76, they actually tuned the hotel up quite a bit, added wings and added observation towers and so on, the lower slide, that was done to make the hotel a destination for the American Centennial, which the Wilson brothers were also enormously involved in, both designing the train stations for the railroad and, as you'll see in a moment, designing the main exhibition halls. They also designed the train stations along the main line for the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is what Ardmore and Bryn Mawr looked like when they were first built in the 1870s. They're interesting buildings, but they don't have the shock value that a great Frank Furness has. And it's in large measure because the way that Joe Wilson thinks is from an engineering perspective first, with the architectural questions sort of piling on second. But they are figures of enormous interest in working across the United States. They do on the right the first great piece of Broad Street Station, 1881, with its train sheds extending out to the rear. On the left, you see what they designed for the Baldwin Potomac, which was a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad that got the Pennsy into Washington, D.C. This station was literally on the wall in the middle, right across from the Capitol. It couldn't have been a better site for a train station. It wasn't great for the plan of the city, but it was wonderful for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this pair of buildings, again, gives you a little sense of the type of work that they're doing. They're largely looking at St. Pancras in London by G.G. Scott and sort of picking up what everybody is doing as opposed to going off and presenting architecture on their own. Where they really hit their stride and become remarkable is when they're given no money and an enormous problem. And in the case of the American Centennial in Philadelphia, those conditions were perfectly met. Philadelphia organized a gigantic fair. The federal government was supposed to kick money in. All the states were supposed to kick money in. There was some regional problem that just happened in the 1860s. The South didn't want to kick money to Senator McConnell from Kentucky wasn't interested in cooperating in all this. And at the last minute, in the spring of 1875, with the fair due to open in a year, they had nothing underway, they had no buildings, and things really looked like a dire disaster. And at that moment, Joseph Wilson and Henry Pettit would end up as an engineer in the Furness office, but these two engineers come up with a wild idea. 1873, the American economy would crash. Big economic depression. Buildings aren't going up, factories aren't being built. There's a huge surplus of building parts and materials. And they get the idea that if they design the new main exhibition hall and machinery hall using the sort of standardized parts of the standard industrial mill system, they can put these gargantuan buildings up. The one on the bottom is 1,876 feet long. Gargantuan. The machinery hall that was across from it was over 1,000 feet long. The two of them, with their central courtyard between, stretched the distance from what would be Center City Hall all the way to Independence Hall. That type of space. And they did it with the idea that when the fair was over, they would just dismantle the buildings and put the parts back into the supply chain, and hopefully the economy would pick up. And they would basically rent the materials for the fair and pay almost nothing. They pay for the labor, and they put the materials back into the supply chain. That in fact worked. The fair came in at so much below the costs that were actually paid for that they were able to do the horticultural hall and do this vast array of stuff on budget, on time, opened in January of 1876 to receive the stuff, the exhibits, and the whole fair went off of that. Just an extraordinary story. So these figures, these architects who start your campus here, are really critical figures in understanding what's possible. They will continue to be the architects. They will often create their own business after 1876. They organize themselves as the Wilson Brothers. And they remain the Pennsylvania Railroad's main architects. They do Russell Station, they do the Crescent Mountain House, they do destination hotel resorts all around the East Coast where the railroad sends people by train and builds a destination hotel. This is one out in the middle of Pennsylvania. At the same time, in the same decade, Frank Furness is off doing very different buildings. He's doing buildings that are remarkably intense and expressive, covering the full array of architectural project types, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in the upper left, the Centennial Bank, and many of the banks at Bankers Row in downtown. Highly identifiable buildings that sort of muscle and jab their way into your attention. Houses such as the Griscom House that you all could have bought for less than nothing 2 weeks ago, and clubs such as Undine Barge Club on the Schuylkill River. A great array, huge numbers of projects, different scale, different type. What was interesting was that while he's doing these things, he also has a sub-practice designing the houses for the home for the presidents of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So while they're not hiring them for their train stations and for their major hotels at the resorts that they're creating, they're hiring to do their houses. So he's tightly connected to them. Thomas Scott has Furness design the house at the bottom of Rittenhouse Square, and the Furness office comes back and heads the wing towards you with the big colonial doorway later in the 1880s. George Roberts, who will follow Scott, lives out in Ballackenwood at St. Asaph's, and the wing on the right of that house with a big chimney coming out of it in the little porch, that's a Frank Furness design wing for George Roberts. We think he also did Roberts' Pencoid Ironworks office building down off Writers Mill Road. Frank Thompson, the president at the very end of the century, the last only 2 years, commissions Furness to do his house on Union Avenue in Lower Marion, Broker Hill. A.J. Cassatt has been a neighbor of Frank Furness's partner, Alan Evans, has the initial house at the top. Cheswold was designed by Henry Sims, but the big wing off on the left side with a huge chimney is Frank Furness. The house below, which will become Cassatt's house on Rittenhouse Square, was built as a developer house on the square. Then Furness's brother-in-law, Thurman Rogers, acquired it, and Furness tuned it up in the 1870s. And then the firm adds the top floor and the central bay and the front bays and moves the entrance from the center to the side. There's all sorts of things inside for A.J. Cassatt. So this is Cassatt's house. And finally, in the year after Furness dies, his office is still doing important houses for the next president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Samuel Gray. This is Waverly, the retirement community on Waverly Road. that Furness's office also did. This is a project that George Howe, who will go on to fame and fortune doing PSFS, the great modern skyscraper in Center City, works on. So sort of fun to see the extent of the work that he's doing. The place Philadelphia and Furness in it requires you to go back and see Philadelphia as it was when Furness was working. Philadelphia was not the 18th century little city of the American Revolution. It was not the tired post-industrial city of the 20th century. It was the noisy, throbbing, explosive, and altogether remarkable center of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century in America, the workshop of the world, the Silicon Valley of the industrial age, with factories extending from block after block in the very part of the city. Top is the Baldwin Motor Works, and you see it extending from Broad Street to the west. In the middle of it is the William Sellers Machine Tool Company, which is a premier machine tool maker in the world in the 19th century. Across from it is George Whitney, who makes the cast iron car wheels. Next to it is John Crescen's tool company. There's one thing after all these things are all there and all sort of working with each other and all of it. And they're creating and transforming the nature of work in ways that you can barely imagine. In the lower left, you have a locomotive being carried from one workstation to another on an overhead crane, because Edgar Williams has changed the Baldwin Works from a rather typical 19th century industrial small piecework process to basically a mechanized production line. And by the time he gets done with Baldwin in the 1870s, he has been making between 5 and 10 steam engines a day in this plant. It is cranking out 3,000 locomotives a year. It's just extraordinary what is happening here. And so that's the city that Philadelphia is. It's a city that has a modest financial district, a modest insurance district. What it has is the greatest assemblage of industry in America. And Frank Furness comes into this city as the child of a New England-born minister whose closest friend is the guy on the other left, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who makes the case in the early 1830s that America should turn its back on Europe, should find art and culture and designs that are rooted in the values and energy of the American democracy, that we should use the locomotives and the railroads, which he calls the magician's iron, that is going to knit the country together as the source of our design ideas, that we should be looking at nature, we should be looking at things other than history to make art that is about us and our world. Simultaneously, it's also a city in which there is internal to it a remarkable design culture that is represented by that great machine that you see on the upper right, a planing machine designed by William Sellers. And Sellers is a major player in this narrative. Sellers' firm comes up with a couple of aphorisms in their design of machines that begins to connect what Furness will do to what he is doing. Sellers says very simply that when a machine is right, it looks right. That there's a relationship between the form of the machine and the design of the machine. And that's an idea that a kid in Frank Furness's office, Louis Sullivan, is going to take to Chicago and hammer into form follows function, and that will be pretty close to what these folks want. But the bigger thing that they come up with is a theory of design in which they very carefully figure out what the problem is and then design to it, as opposed to starting from precedent and chipping away at it. In a major lecture that William Sellers' nephew Coleman Sellers gave in 1874 as part of the run-up to the centennial, where the Franklin Institute organized a big exhibit in the old Pennsylvania Railroad Freight Terminal, which is where Wanamaker's now is. It was an exhibit of just machines, locomotives, giant machines made by sellers and other businesses in Philadelphia. He started with a really interesting idea. He said that you'll notice that all these machines are painted red. And he said it's not because of the Quakers. It's a really important thing. The rest of the world has assumed that Philadelphia's design that is so different from everybody else's is rooted in the fact that Quakers don't care about what things look like. And he said that's not true. We care deeply, but we're trying to tell you something. This gray represents the metal out of which these are made, and that's the narrative we're talking about. Then he goes along and he says this profoundly important thing. He says that what we realize is that new purposes need new forms. That you can't just take a medieval church and stuff it with books and call it a library, what they've done at Harvard School Hall. You can't take a classical temple and put a few counters in it and call it a bank. These things don't work. What you need to do is you need to make the machine solve the problem. And this set of ideas is going to spin out into what Frank Furness will be looking at in architecture in exactly the same time. So my sense is that this is sort of the prelude. The other counter that's kind of interesting, may actually not be always done. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that Philadelphia has this kind of functional expressive mode, but the Furness family's connection to Emerson brings this other side in, the transcendental New England culture, the intellectual culture, which makes the case that design itself is purposeful. When you bring those two streams together, the New England intellectual frame and the Philadelphia industrial frame, you basically get the constituent elements that are going to make Frank Furness. Frank Furness isn't a wild and crazy guy. Frank Furness is, in fact, the rational creation of an industrial culture looking to solve problems in a way that reflects the culture and values of this place. So that will then affect what Furness does in his design over the 40 years that he begins to work beginning in the 1860s into the early 20th century. And in that period, he will design, his firm will design some, at this point we've got him up to I think 750 projects. And we know that things are still showing up, and we really go out and look, more buildings show up. We think he's actually alive in some basement still. But the interesting thing is that this really means that he's doing a building every other week for 40 weeks. It's extraordinary. And in that process and in that number, you begin to see that Frank Furness can't be dealt with as a rogue architect who is outside the main, because you don't get to do 1,000 commissions if you're a rogue architect outside the main. You may get to do 10, you may get to do 20, but you certainly don't get to work at that pace and for the clientele that Frank Furness is going to assemble. That clientele is going to be the Academy of Fine Arts and the principal elite institutions of Philadelphia. It's medical hospitals, it's libraries, it's going to be the major universities, it's going to be the major private clients, and every single way, Frank Furness is going to dominate the who's who of this city. And he's going to do it in ways that, in a sense, create the identity that these new industrialists want to have. They don't want to be portrayed in the way that a Bostonian would do in some sort of proper thing, looking to history or a New Yorker looking to fashion. And so the Academy of Fine Arts gives him a job in which he basically says, I'm going to put a giant steel truss down the side of the Cherry Street elevation to carry the galleries above the studios. And they say, fine, no problem. He leaves steel and iron exposed in the Academy galleries and auditoriums. Not a big deal. He makes the gigantic steel girders that separate, so the design of the great reading room of the library, makes perfect sense to these folks. And he even goes so far as to turn industrial forms. These are big spring clips that he turns into the ornament for a railing of the Gardner Gassat house down on Locust Street. He is looking at the industrial world. He relishes what it can do. He brings it into his architecture, and creates new possibilities. It isn't just the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's worth knowing that he's also working for the president of the Reading Railroad. He does his house, horrible photograph, hopefully you find it better on someday, in Mount Airy. He does 125 commissions for the Reading Railroad in 4 or 5 years as a sideline to his regular business while he's cranking out everything else. This is the sort of bulk of them as you see them running through from Maryland into New Jersey. And he comes up with his own design theory that's not unlike what the machine makers are coming up with. Furness realizes that the big problem for all of us on trains is that when you're lost in your newspaper and you suddenly say, where am I, and you look over your shoulder, you don't want to have to find a little sign that says, I'm in such and such way on the Chestnut Hill West line, all those Pennsylvania railroad stations look the same. But Furness makes the whole building into a sign. So when you are going past it and you look at it, you say, oh, I'm at Gregor's, my stop is next, and you have no problem figuring that out. He makes the building a sign, but he also does extraordinarily creative, just playing with form, looking at how you can express ideas and create logical relationships to the problems at hand. These little buildings, little sort of throwaway structures, signal towers for the Reading Railroad. Some of them must have imagined little structures that they made great tree houses. I always think of the signal towers on the lower right as sort of Victorian corseted ladies. This little signal tower on the left with basically a square plan with the point of the corner toward the track so that you have windows on both sides. You can look up and down the tracks and both directly see what's going on. Just exactly like an international modern architect with the corner window. And Furness is really thinking out. And then he rotates the roof 45 degrees so you get that wonderful juxtaposition. Just, it's inventive, creative, extraordinary design, and doing it in an extraordinary pace. When he finishes his work for the Reading allies with the Baldwin Hotel to try to compete with the Pennsy to create a through route from Washington to New York, with the B&O having been, pardon my French, just totally screwed by the Pennsylvania Railroad. They've been partners on a railroad. And one day the B&O discovered that the Pennsy had bought out that railroad and gives them notice that in 3 years, good luck, you can't use these tracks. And what it was going to mean was that the B&O was going to be stopped at Baltimore and couldn't get into Philadelphia. And so the B&O found a route, was kind of circuitous, that they could sneak in along the Schuylkill River, drop a depot at 24th and Chestnut, a little tiny connecting railroad that gave them access through Philadelphia, which had used city council to try to keep them. City council corrupts, I can imagine, but who knew? And then once they put that together, they came back, created a new line from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and hired the former architect of Reading to do all of their stations, which had to be done in the space of about a year. 37 stations, so you're going to pile that on top of everything else that he's doing. And you can figure this all out. Beautiful, wonderful little buildings. These are all little cyanotypes that just show up as an exhibit on these railroad stations at the library company, sort of fun to see. But this is what he's doing there. And when he gets to Philadelphia, he has an extraordinary station that stood in a totally bizarre location, 2 stories above grade level, at the height of the Chestnut Street Bridge, which was the crossing of the river that the trains are going to go underneath. And the problem was to get you, the public, from street level down 2 stories into the waiting rooms that connected to the tracks along the river. It was a total reversal of the usual train station in which the tracks are elevated and the entrance is down the street level. Here you've got the whole thing sort of flipped around. But Furness figures it out, and in the process does a room which is maybe the most extraordinary room in 19th century American architecture. This gigantic room with nothing but steel, iron, glass, and concrete, all industrial materials that when you come in from Baltimore or from Washington and you're looking at sort of historically shaped train stations, when you walk into Philadelphia, it's like walking into a factory, it's like walking into this industrial world, just extraordinary building. It was made more extraordinary because Furness figured out that the way you get people to understand what you want was to use natural light. And so he creates stairs with gargantuan windows that light the stairs and that pull you to the point where he wants you to do the same thing he pulls here on the Baldwin School, where the big stair rises to that wonderful window and basically pulls you to it. Furness figures that out. So, in 1890, Furness has done houses for the Pensies, but he has not done major projects for the Pensies. And as you know, in 1889, the Keystone Hotel that the Wilson Brothers designed is burned. And the Pensies, first of all, thinks about having the neighborhood architect who lives across the street, Addison Hutton, who's, you know, truly regularly and quite dull. You know, when you go to a tower, it's pretty simple stuff. And after about an hour and a half of thinking about that, they say, no, we can't do that. And they create a competition, which ends up with Frank Furness being given the commission. And Furness designs the building that you call the Residence, which is this extraordinary and wonderful hotel. We're going to come back to it in a moment, but I want to show you his ongoing work. This is the Wilson Brothers now imitating Furness in the Adirondacks, just so you can know the Furness influencing them. They're still working. But in 1891-92, Furness begins a dozen ferry boat project designs, where the naval architect designs the ferry boat, Furness designs the interior fittings, and also the exterior. The little ferry boat on the right is stamped metal. Think of it like car makers stamp metal because it gives greater rigidity to the metal. It isn't just making the shapes and forms that makes them streamline and go really fast, but it's also that those stampings help by their creases and forms to rigidify the metal. Furness stamps his metal to look like the big chunks of stone on the arches of that ferry. It's really whimsical and then does these wonderful interiors with leaded glass, again the same glass that you have here in the ferry boats. And then he begins a dozen or so major projects from Pittsburgh through the new Broad Street station and all the way to New York for stations for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he suddenly now gets into his sort of traditional métier. And the largest and most important thing he will do is to win the competition for the Broad Street station that the Pennsylvania Railroad commissions to enlarge the original Wilson Brothers station, which is over there on the right in the top and bottom left pictures, and to then frame a gargantuan train shed, 16 tracks, with a screen of offices that will make it possible for the railroad to move its entire operations from 4th Street down to their train center that will connect them easily to the rest of the country by train. So it's a great idea. And Furness basically sort of picks up the details of the tower and the sort of Gothic of the Wilson Brothers, and then vastly enlarges it and turns it into this much bigger and more powerful building that then fronts that incredible train station that stretches for blocks. This building went from 15th to 18th Street in downtown Philadelphia. The first 3 blocks in the center were Broad Street Station. Well, within about 3 years, this wasn't adequate for the office space. And Furness comes back and adds to the top of the Wilson Brothers building, and then very quickly, he builds the arcade building across the street, across Market Street from Broad Street Station, connects it by a bridge directly from the train landing level of the train station, so that people can come in by train, go across the bridge, and either flow out through stairs into the city, or go into more offices for the Pennsylvania Railroad, with this complex filling basically the entire block between 15th and Market and Chestnut Street, and ultimately added to by a huge tower that the Furness office will also do in 1913. Again, George Howe involved in that in the Furness office. So this is an extraordinary complex that the Pennsylvania Railroad does that houses thousands of its workers across the street from City Hall. Basically, is a sort of corporate identity versus the city's identity. And then into the 20th century, he continues to do some extraordinary projects. Many of you have ever gotten off the train in Wilmington. This is the recently restored Joseph Biden Amtrak station, which Furness designed, again, as a sort of a reversal of the norm. The Pennsylvania Railroad in 1905, under A.J. Cassatt as president, realized that it needed to solve two major issues to make it a truly effective railroad. It had to connect by tunnels under the Hudson to get directly into Manhattan, because up until then, if you took a train to Jersey City, you stepped off into one of those 12 ferry boats that Furness had designed. The ferry boat took you across the river, which dumped you over on the west side of the city, which it wasn't where you wanted to be. And you then had to connect over to wherever you wanted to go in the city of New York. And Cassatt figures out that the answer is tunnels, and drives the tunnels under the Hudson that make it possible for the Pennsy to come through the center of Manhattan into the McKinley White Penn Station that is still mourned. But then in all the other cities, from Jersey City to Washington, the trains tended to be at street level, and being at street level, they ran into problems with traffic, and traffic slowed them down and created risk where every year 2 or 3 people were killed by trains. And so Cassatt gets the idea that if the true cities, he's going to basically elevate all the tracks, basically a story and a half, create underpasses for all the traffic so that the trains and the traffic are in different planes, and just simply solve the railroad crossing problem once and for all. And in this instance, what it does is it gives Furness a chance to once again shine in a creative way. You have the northbound to New York side on the south side of the tracks, and then you have the Washington-bound piece on the north side of the tracks. And the problem is, of course, that you like to be able to connect these things. And Furness connects them by just simply creating the lobby under the tracks. So basically, the enormous steel trestles that are carrying the railroads up above you become, as you can see on this photograph on the right, the ceiling of the lobby down below. And what is extraordinary when you're in the station and you hear the trains rumbling overhead, you realize that you're, right in the middle of all the action. You can go either way and go upstairs. Just a remarkable piece of design. But what's also remarkable is that Furness, into the 20th century, when everybody else is going to form white and, McKinley, Leaden White, and Daniel Burnham, Chicago World's Fair, White City stuff, Furness is still doing industrial architecture with pieces of steel, little crisscrosses, and making you see the industrial world that really is the heart of all this. So that's Furness for the painting. For this building, some interesting points that we can make as well. Hotels have a pretty regularized strategy. Basically, you do some sort of lanes that contain the guest room, and some sort of center piece that becomes the point that marks the entry. On the right, you've got a hotel that Furness did at Lake Patcon, the Breslin, which he does this scheme. Down below, you've got the Windsor Hotel he did in Atlantic City, and you see the same type of motif here in the center of the Baldwin School, the Bryn Mawr Hotel. But what is really interesting here is that the forms that he's looking at, the way that he's doing it, are going to be tied to ideas that come out of the industrial culture of Philadelphia. I just did an article a couple years ago at the Library of Penn, where I finally realized that while everybody thinks of the library as sort of a cathedral because it's got a round end and gargoyles, but what it really is the fact that this huge stair out front that collects all of the traffic, all the circulation of the building, is exactly what the big Philadelphia factory owners did when they made their huge floor plan, attached the tower to it, so the stairs and the toilets and all of the secondary stuff didn't get in the way of laying out machines in the factory floor. And what Furness has done in the library is to basically put an industrial tower on front of the factory floor, which is the place where you pick up and read your books. One of the interesting discussions in the library referred to the tower in a different way that I thought was kind of interesting. It was referred to as a lighthouse. And that made me see the tower at the hotel as something of that type of form, something of a lighthouse form, trying to make this building visible from the point of landing over at Bryn Mawr Station, considerable distance away, such that this building would be visible to the tourists coming for the first time. It was sort of a nice idea. And of course, you find those little screw pile lighthouses down on the eastern shore being designed to go at the same time. And as I look at that and its shaping, its porches and its dormers and this little sequence, I find that a much more comforting source for Furness than the historical forms of Loire Valley castles that we've often thought he was looking at. My suspicion is that he's looking more at the lighthouse than the Loire Valley. And I think it was interesting that Furness had been figuring out, he figured this out first at the Academy of Fine Arts, where as you come in through a kind of a dark entrance vestibule, you come to a giant stair that Lou Kahn always thought was too big for its room. In its bigness as it comes forward, it sort of forces you to go up rather than to dally around and try to get into trouble at lower levels. So the Academy pulls you in and up. And at the Penn Library, of course, that was also the point. The thing the librarians really hated were the gigantic reading rooms that everybody would wander through to get to the stairs, to the auditorium, the lecture hall, the type of thing that Furness's great Boston rival, Henry Hobson Richardson, did all the time. And librarians just hated that. Furness understands, because he worked at Penn with the greatest committee of library theoreticians of the world in this book has done, but they just won't tolerate that. So he makes this stair that at the very entrance fills the space, basically forces you, if you have no business going into the library, to go up the stair to the auditorium on the second floor. And then he does it in a way that I think is extremely interesting for you. He basically makes the stair a lesson in the various states of iron and steel, so that you can see cast, wrought, and rolled steel all in one place, and understand the new materials of the industrial age. What's interesting, of course, with your stair is he does pretty much the same thing. Where we would expect in a first-class elite hotel built in the 1890s that we would get naked dark moldings and classic detail and so on. Frank Furness, working in the industrial culture of Philadelphia, is perfectly happy to give you exposed steel stringers with the rivets that hold the treads in place as part of the ornament, in a sense. And then the little trick that he's learned in the academy, he learned at the library, is that then flare the stair out as it comes past the line of columns and make it a great event. So in this sense, everything that Furness has learned in his railroad stations and in his public architecture comes into this building. I love that wall of light at the head of the stairs that just pulls you to it as you come in. Another thing I thought was interesting was that when you look at the materials of the building, you also see an industrial connection. One of the things that has always interested me is the rough stone walls with the brick arches and the brick detailing in the main building. And what was particularly interesting to me as I have been driving through Manningham for many years is that this, of course, is the vocabulary of the great factories along the Schuylkill at Manningham, where you use the local stone quarried rather roughly, and then you regularize your arches and tune them up so that they can receive standardized windows with brick arches, and in this instance, a nice brick cornice on the top. But going on the lower left is a further connection that Furness makes. That's the rear view, because the light was bad, for the front view of the gorgeous home for indigent widows. The Victorians had a way with telling us like it was. The gorgeous home for Widows, which was a house that the industrialists had built for the widows of men who were killed in the factories, many. And if you look at the materials, it's the same vocabulary of the local stone and the brick arches and little fans and decorative bits of brick and nice furnace chimneys and a big ventilator in the center, all of the things that Furness is interested in. When I see that, when I see this building, I see Furness continuing to ally his building and his architecture with the industrial world that is at the center of the culture of 19th century Philadelphia. You see that as well in the really wonderful interior fittings of big industrial slabs of stone. There's nothing nice about this fireplace. And then I love the stair railings with those cast iron panels with the holes in it that are cast into it, and then you get light through it. You get wonderful patterns on the wall. Just fabulous use of material for decorative purposes in a secondary way. What's going to happen in the 20th century is the rest of the world is going to go away from this. Everybody gets the historical ideas and history will rule. Frank Furness's ex-partner, George Hewitt, who designed the Baldwin School Hotel in a grand French empire mode, and obviously Bruce Price does the Chateau Fontenoy as only a castle could wish to be. In fact, these become the buildings that mark what hotels are. But Furness's pupils don't fall for this. Furness's pupils, the kids that come out of his office, go off to Atlantic City and do the Blenheim and the Train War, and buildings that are profound reflections of what they are. This is William Price's Blenheim Hotel that was blown up around 1980 for perfectly reasonable structural problem issues, but it still galls me to see it. But to tell you that architecture can be either based on historical form or can be new creations aimed at the future. And Furness's best pupils will get this idea and they will carry it forward into the 20th century, where they then continue to influence architecture right up to our own time. Michael Graves' Disney Hotel has an awful lot of the Blenheim Hotel in Atlantic City at the core of its building. So that's it. Question or two, and then if you wish, we can walk out into the lobby and walk around and look at some stuff. Whatever interests you, I am your person for the next half hour or so before I turn into a pumpkin. Yes?
Did Furness ever design bridges like Baldwin has?
No. Furness, one of the great stories, one of the great people that I know and deeply love is Nick Giamopoulos, so the great engineer David Kahn, Robert Venturi, just extraordinary. Nick put a piece of steel in the upper level of the Centennial Bank to repair the trusses that Furness had designed. And he described Frank Furness to me in a word that I had always seen as a positive word that he used in a negative way. He called him optimistic. Furness, in many of his buildings, is clearly optimistic. The Unitarian Church downtown, which the trusses are failing to the point that they've had to post them up. The Holy Apostles Church at 21st and Christian, some of the problems. Furness is not an engineer. And when he does important projects with major engineering, he hires engineers to work with the Academy of Fine Arts, Clark and Reeves out of the Phoenix Iron Company, the great train shed at Broad Street Station, the Wilson Brothers actually did. That's where Furness does. Furness doesn't do bridges because the Wilson Brothers do bridges. And they do bridges from Maine to the Rocky Mountains and down to Texas. Basically, where Furness is doing a building every other week, they're doing a bridge a week. And so the market is saturated with that.
What is the Furness story about the Gerard Knight building?
That's a great one. There are two great stories. When we were first working on the 70s. We went through all of the materials that George Wood Furness, the grandson, had. And one of the things that he had was an envelope with drawings relating to a lawsuit between Furness and his partner, Alan Evans. And the lawsuit was over the fact that Furness had created a deal in his office that the person who brought the work in and did the job got the bulk of the commission. And in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, when Furness was bringing in all the work and all of the jobs, that was making money for Furness in a very nice way. And to the point that I suspect that one of the reasons that a lot of the railroad work doesn't go through the office is because it lets him keep the fees. So there's that thing going. In 1905, the Girard Trust people decided they wanted a new library, or a new bank. And they put out the word to a number of architects, one of which was not the Furness office. And Furness got really hot under the collar and said, what's going on? He was informed that the bankers did not want his usual red brick architecture. And Furness, I know what they want, and basically went back to his student years in Richard Morris Hunt's atelier in New York, they call him Beaux-Arts, and comes up with a classical design. Those drawings were taken in to the bank and by Alan Evans, traveling under the ruse that it's Evans' design and not Furness. And the Girard people say, you don't let that old guy get his hands on the drawings. You get what you get, this is really great. What there was, in addition to a lawsuit or a set of drawings that Furness had initially exhibits, were exactly the plan of that building in his hand. Clearly, he was the designer of that building. The bank accepted the Furness trading as Alan Evans' design, and then forced the office to merge with McKimby and White to detail it, to get the classical detail this way. So that's the building that we had. And the lawsuit was over the fact that Alan Evans, under his name, wanted to keep the commission, and Furness made him pay. But there's another little neat side story that God knows is letting her up. Makes sense to me. If you look up on the side of the facade toward Chestnut Street, you have the cornice, and there's an element called the raking ceiling, which is the cornice that comes down from the pediment. And you'll see about 4 feet of very nicely carved with Athenian leaves. And then it just stops. And the story that the Girard folks told me a long time ago was that Effingham Morris, who was president of the bank at that point, had walked along, studied his bank's progress, and asked the contractor how much that carving cost. It was what it cost $1 a foot. And he said, have him stop at once. So, those are the 2 stories I know.
You mentioned a number of his students, Sullivan and Hotel. Who were some of the other students that we could follow in their history?
Well, the major figures. Basically, the thesis that I'm advancing as I look at this is that obviously Furness is a part and more critically, that modern architecture in America basically goes back to this office. That the guys who write the theory, Louis Sullivan, Will Price, always go back to a certain group of theoretical ideas. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Frank's father's closest friend from 5-year history through life, and a big part of Frank's life. Walt Whitman, whom the Furness family supports while living in Camden. These are the American figures, the sort of American scriptures that lay out an idea of an American design sense rooted in life and the contemporary world, not history of European practice. And that's the stuff that informs the progressive side of American architecture. The same lines that you see in the writing all come back to his office. Furness teaches Louis Sullivan, who goes to Chicago and teaches Frank Furness, sort of sets off the Prairie School, teaches Will Price, teaches George Howe, who connects to Lou Kahn and Robert Venturi. That Philadelphia school line is absolutely directly in Furness. And then out on the West Coast, Irving Gill, who comes out of Sullivan's office and has a partner for a while, Frank Mead, who comes out of Will Price's office. That's the West Coast school. Three big lines all come to this office. And those are the people that I think really matter. There's a lot of kids that go through and don't get what he's doing. That, basically are bristling under the fact that Furness is working in this industrial way and trying to create an identity for a Philadelphia culture that is unique and different from Boston and New York. And they will go off as soon as they escape from Furness's office and do historical stuff. Open Stewartson, do the quad and the historical buildings at Penn, that game. And the equivalent of Furness in a way, for you who know the Philadelphia architectural scene over the last years, is that Furness was like the Vincent Kling of Philadelphia. That every young kid worth his salt went through the Kling office, and the sharp kids stayed there for about a year, learned what they could and got out. And the rest became Klingons and were part of the board that made Kling's office all powerful but not terribly interesting. Furness's office, I suspect, had aspects of that. And the really sharp kids came through, got the message that architecture ought to come out of life, bailed out, and went off. The less interesting kids stayed for a while until they just resisted and wanted to do what everybody else was doing, and they went on. And then the really dull ones just stayed. The really major guns, the guys that really shape American architecture, are all connected to this powerful set of ideas that come out of the core of the fusion of New England Transcendentalism and Philadelphia Industrialism. When those merge, you get contemporary architecture.
The major stairs, when elevators come in, will the stairs become decoration or are they functional?
Stairs are always, in major public buildings, a functional element until you get about 3 or 4 stories. And so in the case of this hotel, the stair was the major means up and down. The library was the major means up and down. All those train stations were the major means up and down. ADA hadn't arrived. People had to start to figure out that there were some people who couldn't use stairs. But the stair was the vehicle. In most architectural design in the 19th century, the stair is one of the 2 or 3 great opportunities where the architect shows his stuff. And in the case of the traditional architect, it's heavily carved, turned into a sort of traditional work of art painted in stone and wood, and made into this showpiece of craft. Furness goes the other direction. Furness gives you a stater that tells you about the world that you live in. And I think it's so interesting that in this thing that everybody else turns into high decoration, Furness leaves the industrial character at the front.
I was always struck in this building about how different fireplaces are. And I don't know anything about why that's so, but every room you go in, they're completely different stuff. They look like they could have built 100 pieces apart.
I don't know. I've never really taken the time to dig out all the details of this building. The main fireplace in the main lobby, the brownstone fireplace with the slabs of stone and the very stylized pilasters, that's classic Furness, the geometric carving, classic Furness. My guess is that over time, many of these fireplaces were updated and changed. And it would be interesting to dig back, see what the early photographs show, see if any of these, this is the moment, the beginning of the colonial revival. So it's conceivable that they're just doing something. But it's also conceivable that in 1910, they were updated and these were done. And that's a puzzle that will have to be track down over time. Someone's going to have to do the archival research, see what the various alterations are, and see, what we can start to figure out. Okay.
Well, George, as head of this wonderful school, and understanding how much this building means to so many people who are both connected with Baldwin and beyond Baldwin's walls, and your wisdom has brought so much light to us this evening, so we thank you so much for being here. We have a small gift we'd like to present to you as a memento of the evening. You will enjoy. We thank you and to the class of 1985 for their work in bringing George to us this evening, and for everyone